Alrighty, welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth, and we're going to continue with some more Authority by Jeff Vandermeer. Let's see, previously on, and hello, Optical Antenna. Thanks for tuning in. Good morning to you. Um, Major things that happened last installment. I don't know. It's been a long week. Uh, Gosh. I know the last thing they were doing. They were driving off to the military base that oversees the only entrance to Area X that people can return through, apparently. Uh, Except for, all the people who managed to return from Area X from the last couple expeditions that are not going through there, or if they are, nobody's seeing them do it. So, how about that? We had got introduced to Cheneyisms. What else? Oh yeah, we discovered the plant and the mouse in the drawer. That's right. More on that later. There will be explanations for these things, sort of. Maybe not in this book, but definitely there will be explanations for that, at least. Whatever was the mouse? Well, I know we can explain the plant. I don't know if we can explain the mouse. I mean, I think the mouse is just a mouse. But is the plant a plant? My God, who knows? I'll tell you who knows. This little miniature iceberg floating down the river, ogling at me. Well, okay, it's the bird on the iceberg that's ogling me. It's like looking right up here. Goofy. Neato. Alrighty. So we are eventually going to get a vocabulary lesson. I don't know how long we have to go before that kicks in. Not too many pages, so I will not be proven a liar too early on. Let's see. Another thing you'll notice that this book likes to do a lot, and unfortunately I didn't pick the best possible place to break last week, is it switches. It keeps flipping between something that's happening in a slightly more present time versus something that happened a couple hours ago. And this is going to be one of those times, because where we pick up is from a couple hours ago, relative time. All right. So sit back, relax, and we'll get cracking. Sorry about that. Dropped my bookmark and had to spend the last 30 seconds digging for it. 009. Evidence. Finally, they had addressed the mouse in the room and the plant during their meeting about the wall beyond his door. What about this mouse, this plant? Control had demanded, to see what that shook loose. Is this a memorial too? Plant and mouse still resided inside the pot, had not yet leapt out and gone for their throats, even though Sue had kept a keen eye on the pot during the entire meeting. Whitby, though, wouldn't even acknowledge it with a glance, looked like a cat ready to leap off in the opposite direction at the slightest sign of impending pot-activated danger. "No, not really," Grace conceded after a pause. "She was trying to kill it." "What?" "It wouldn't die." She said it. She said it with contempt, as if breaking the natural order of things wasn't a miracle, but an affront. The assistant director made Whitby embark upon a summary of hair-raising attempts at destruction that included stabbings, careful burnings, deprivation of soil and water, introduction of parasites, general neglect, the emanation of hateful vibes, verbal and physical abuse, and much, much more. Whitby reenacted some of these events with overly manic energy. Clippings had been rushed to Central, and perhaps even now scientists labored to unlock the plant's secrets. But Central had sent no information back, and nothing the director had done could kill it, not even sticking it in a locked drawer. Except someone had taken pity on the plant and watered it, perhaps even stuck in a dead mouse for nutritional value. Control looked with suspicion upon both Whitby and Grace. The idea that one of them had been merciful only made him like them both a little more. Sue had then piped up. "She took it from the samples room, I believe. The samples rooms, I believe. It was from Area X originally. A very common plant, although I'm not a botanist." "Then, by all means, lead the way to the samples rooms." Except that Sue, as a linguist, didn't have security clearance. A few miles from the border, the landscape changed, and Whitby had to slow down to about 10 miles an hour as the road narrowed and became more treacherous. The dark pines and the patches of swamp gave way to a kind of subtropical rainforest. Control could see the curling question marks of fiddlehead ferns and a surprising density of delicate, black-winged mayflies as the jeep passed over several wooden bridges that crossed a welter of creeks. The smell of the land had changed from humid and cloying to something as questing as the ferns, a hint of freshness caused by a thicker canopy of leaves. They were, he realized, making their way along the periphery of a huge sinkhole, the kind of topographical anomaly that created an entirely different habitat. Sinkhole parks in the area were, for whatever reason, favorite teen hangouts, and sometimes, after leaving Headley with their ill-gotten six-packs, they had headed for rendezvous with girls there. The sinkholes, he remembered, had been litter grounds of crushed beer cans and a scattering of condom wrappers. The kinds of places the local police kept an eye on because it was a rare weekend someone didn't get into a fight there. More surprising still, white rabbits could be seen, nimbly negotiating the edges of pools of standing water, and brown leaf-littered moist spaces where the rotting of the earth proceeded apace, and red-tipped mushrooms rose primordial. Which caused Control to interrupt one of Cheney's stutter-step monologues. "Are those what I think they are?" Cheney, clearly relieved that Control had said something. "Yes, those are the true descendants of the experiment, the ones that got away. They breed, well, just like rabbits. There was an eradication effort, but it was taking up too many resources, so he just let it happen now." Control followed the progress of one white brute, larger than his fellows, or larger than her fellows, who sought the higher ground in limitless leaps and bounds. There was something defiant in its stride. Or Control was projecting that onto the animal, just as he was projecting onto most of the other rabbits a peculiar stillness and watchfulness. Whitby chimed in unexpectedly. "Rabbits have 3 eyelids and can't vomit." For a moment, Control, startled that Whitby had spoken, assigned more significance to the statement than it deserved. You know, it's a good reminder to be humble, Cheney said, like a rumbling steamroller intent on paving over Whitby. To be humbled. A humbling experience. Something like that. What if some of them are returnees? Control asked. What? Control thought Cheney had heard, but he repeated the question. You mean from across the border? They got across and came back? Well, that would be bad. That would be sloppy. Because we know they've spread fairly far, one's savvy enough to survive. And as happens, some of them have gotten out of the containment zone and been trapped by enterprising souls and sold to pet stores. So you're saying that it's possible that some of the progeny of your 15-year-old experiment are now residing in people's homes? As pets? Control was astonished. I wouldn't put it quite that way, but that's the gist, I guess, Cheney conceded. Remarkable, was Control's only comment, aghast. Not really, Cheney replied, pushing back gently but firmly. Way of the world, or at least of invasive species everywhere. I could sell you a python from the Dread Peninsula that's got the same motivations. Whitby, a few moments later, the most he said in one gulp during the whole trip. The few white and brown ones are the offspring of white rabbits mating with the native marsh rabbits. We call them border specials, and the soldiers shoot and eat them. But not the pure white ones, which I don't think makes sense. Why shoot any of them? Why not shoot all of them? Why eat any of them? 50,000 samples languished in the long rooms that formed the second floor of the left-hand side of the U, assuming an approach from the parking lot. They'd gone before lunch, left Sue behind. They had to don white biohazard suits with black gloves, so that Control was actually wearing a version of the gloves that had so unsettled him down in the science division. This was his revenge, to plunge his hands into them and make them his puppets, even if he didn't like their rubbery feel. The atmosphere was like that inside a cathedral, and as if the science division had been some kind of rehearsal for this event, the sequence of airlocks was the same. An ethereal, heavenly music should have been playing, and the way the light struck the air meant that in certain pools of illumination, Control could see floating dust motes, and certain archways and supporting walls imbued the rooms with a numinous feeling, intensified by the high ceilings. This is my favorite place in the Southern Reach, Whitby told him, face alight through his transparent helmet. There's a sense of calm and safety here. Did he feel unsafe in the other sections of the building? Control almost asked Whitby this question, but felt that doing so would break the mood. He wished he had his neoclassical music on headphones for the full experience, but the notes played on in his mind regardless, like a strange yearning. He, Whitby, and Grace walked through in their terrestrial spacesuits like remote gods striding through a divinely chosen terrain. Even though the suits were bulky, the lightweight fabric didn't seem to touch his skin, and he felt buoyant, as if gravity operated differently here. The suit smelled vaguely of sweat and peppermint, but he tried to ignore that. The rows of samples proliferated and extended, the effect enhanced by the mirrors that lined the dividing wall between each hall. Every kind of plant, pieces of bark, dragonflies, the freeze-dried carcasses of fox and muskrat, the dung of coyotes, a section from an old barrel, moss, lichen, and fungi. Wheel spokes and the glazed eyes of tree frogs staring blindly up at him. He had expected, somehow, a Frankenstein laboratory of two-headed calves in formaldehyde, and some hideous manservant with a hunchback lurching ahead of them, and explaining it all in an incomprehensible bouillabaisse of good intentions and slurred syntax. But it was just Whitby, and it was just Grace, and in that cathedral neither felt inclined to explain anything. Analysis by Southern Reach scientists of the most recent samples, taken 6 years ago and brought back by Expedition X-11D, showed no trace of human-created toxicity remained in Area X. Not a single trace. No heavy metals, no industrial runoff or agricultural runoff, no plastics, which was impossible. Control peeked inside the door the assistant director had just opened for him. "There you are," she said, inanely he thought. But there he was, in the main room, with an even higher ceiling and more columns, looking at endless rows and rows of shelves housed inside of a long, wide room. "The air is pure here," Whitby said. "You can get high just from the oxygen levels." Not a single sample had ever shown any irregularities. Normal cell structures, bacteria, radiation levels, whatever applied. But he had also seen a few strange comments in the reports from the handful of guest scientists who had passed the security check and come here to examine the samples, even as they had been kept in the dark about the context. The gist of these comments was that when they looked away from the microscope, the samples changed. And when they stared again, what they looked at had reconstituted itself to appear normal. "There you are." To Control, in that brief glance, staring across the vast litter of objects spread out before him, it mostly looked like a cabinet of curiosities. Desiccated beetle husks, brittle starfish, and other things in jars, bottles, beakers, and boxes of assorted sizes. "Has anyone ever tried to eat any of the samples?" he asked Grace. If they'd just devoured the undying plant, Control was fairly sure it wouldn't have come back. "Shh," she said, exactly as if they were in church and he had spoken too loudly or received a cell phone call. But he noticed Whitby looking at him quizzically, head cocked to one side within his helmet. Had Whitby sampled the samples, despite his terror? Parallel to this thought, the knowledge that Sue and other non-biologists had never seen the samples cathedral. He wondered what they might have read in the striations of the fur of a dead swamp rat, or in the vacant glass eyes of a marsh hawk, its curved beak. What susurrations or utterances might verbalize all unexpected from a cross-section of tree moss or cypress bark. The patterns to be found in twigs and leaves. It was too absurd a thought to give words to, not when he was so new. Or, perhaps, even when he was old in this job, should he be that lucky or unlucky. Let me reread that sentence so that it makes sense. Or perhaps, even when he was old in this job, should he be that lucky or unlucky. Wrong emphasis. It makes sense it makes more sense that way. So there he was. When the assistant director closed the door, they moved on to the next section of the cathedral. Oh, wait. When the assistant director closed the door and they moved on to the next section of the cathedral, Control had to bite his thumb to stop a giggle from escaping. How did he bite his thumb through the suit? He'd had a vision of the samples starting to dance behind that door, freed of the terrible limitations of the human gaze. Our banal, murderous imagination, as the biologist had put it in a rare, unguarded moment with the director before the 12th expedition. In the corridor afterward, with Whitby, a little drained by the experience. "Was that the room you wanted me to see?" No, Whitby said, but did not elaborate. Had he insulted the man with his prior refusal? Even if not, Whitby had clearly withdrawn his offer. Maybe they meant metaphorically biting his thumb? I don't know. Glimpses of towns now under kudzu and other vines, mouldering in the moss. A long abandoned miniature golf course with a pirate theme. The golf greens had been buried in leaves and mud. The half decks of corsairs' ships rose at crazy angles as if from choppy seas of vegetation, masts cracked at right angles and disappearing into the gloom as it began to rain. A gas station lay next door, the roof caved in by fallen trees, the pavement so cracked by gnarled roots that it had crumbled into water-ripe pieces, with the seeming texture and consistency of dark, moist brownies. The fuzzy, irregular shapes of houses and two-story buildings through the trees proved that people had lived here before the evacuation. This close to the border, as little as possible was disturbed. And so these abandoned places could only be broken down by the natural process of decades of rain and decay. The final stretch to the border had Whitby circling ever lower until control was certain they were below. Bleh. The final stretch to the border had Whitby circling ever lower until control was certain they were below sea level, before they came up again slightly to a low ridge upon which sat a drab green barracks, a more official-looking brick building for Army Command and Control, and the local Southern Reach outpost. According to a labyrinthine hierarchical chart that resembled several thick snakes fucking one another, the Southern Reach was under the Army's jurisdiction here, which might be why the Southern Reach facility, closed down between expeditions, looked a bit like a row of large tents that had been made of lemon meringue. Which is to say, it looked like any number of the churches Control had become familiar with in his teenage years, usually because of whatever girl he was dating. The calcification of revivalists and born-agains often took this form, as of something temporary that had hardened and become permanent. And thus it was either a series of white permafrost tents that greeted them, or the white swell of huge waves, frozen forever. The sight was as out of place and startling as if the facility had resembled a fossilized herd of huge moon pies, a delicacy of those youthful years. Army HQ was in a dome-shaped section of the barracks after the final checkpoint, but no one seemed to be around except a few privates standing in the churned mud bath that was the unofficial parking lot. Loitering with no regard for the light rain falling on them, talking in bored but intense talking in wow talking in a bored but intense way while smoking cherry-scented filtered cigarettes. Whatever you want. Fuck off. They had the look of men who had no idea what they guarded, or knew but had been trying to forget. Border Commander Samantha Higgins, who occupied a room hardly larger than a storage closet and just as depressing, was AWOL when they called on her. Higgins' aide-de-camp, "add the camp," as his punning father would have put it, relayed an apology that she'd had to step out and couldn't receive you personally. Almost as if he were a special delivery signature required package. Which was just as well. There had been awkwardness between the two entities after the final 11th expedition had turned up back home. Procedures changed, the security tapes scrutinized again and again. They had rechecked the border for other exit points, looking for heat signals, fluctuations in airflow, anything. Found nothing. So Control thought of Border Commander as a useless or misleading title, and didn't really care that Higgins wasn't there, no matter how Cheney seemed to take it as a personal affront. I told her this was important. She knew this was important. While Whitby took the opportunity to fondle a fern, revealing a hitherto unobserved sensitivity to texture. Control had felt foolish asking Whitby what he meant by saying the terror, but he also couldn't leave it alone, especially after reading over the theories document Whitby had handed him that morning, which he also wanted to talk about. Control thought of the theories as slow death by, given the context. Slow death by aliens. Slow death by parallel universe. Slow death by malign unknown time-traveling force. Slow death by invasion from an alternate Earth. Slow death by wildly divergent technology or the shadow biosphere or symbiosis or iconography or etymology. Death by this and by that. Death by indifference and inference. His favorite. Surface-dwelling terrestrial organism previously unknown. Hiding where all of these years? In a lake? On a farm? At slots in a casino? But he recognized his bottled-up laughter for the onset of hysteria, and his cynicism for what it was, a defense mechanism so he wouldn't have to think about any of it. Death, too, by arched eyebrow. A fair amount of implied or outright, "Your theory is ridiculous, unwarranted, useless." Some of the ghosts of old interdepartmental rivalries resurrected, and coming through in odd ways across sentences. He wondered how much fraternization had taken place over the years, if an archaeologist's written wince at an environmental scientist's seemingly reasonable assertion represented a fair opinion or meant he was seeing an endgame playing out, the final consequence of an affair that had occurred 20 years earlier. So, before the trip to the border, giving up his lunchtime, Control had summoned Whitby to his office to have it out with him about the terror and talk about the theories. Although, as it turned out, they barely touched on the theories. Whitby had perched on the edge of the chair opposite Control and his huge desk, intent and waiting. He was almost vibrating, like a tuning fork, which made Control reluctant to say what he had to say, even though he still said it. "Why did you say 'the terror' earlier? And then you repeated it." Whitby wore an expression of utter blankness, then lit up to the extent that he seemed to levitate for a moment. He had the busy look of a hummingbird in the act of pollination as he said, "Not terror, not terror at all. Terroir." And this time he drew out and corrected the pronunciation of the word, so Control could tell it was not terror. "What is terroir, then?" "A wine term," Whitby said, with such enthusiasm that it made Control wonder if the man had a second job as a sommelier at some upscale Headley restaurant along the Riverwalk. Somehow, though, the man's sudden animation animated Control, too. There was so much obfuscation and so much rote recital at the Southern Reach that to see Whitby excited by an idea lifted him up. "What does it mean?" he asked, although still unsure whether it was a good idea to encourage Whitby. "What doesn't it mean?" Whitby said. "It means the specific characteristics of a place, the geography, geology, and climate that, in concert with the vine's own genetic propensities, can create a startling, deep, original vintage." Now Control was both confused and amused. "How does this apply to our work?" "In all ways." Whitby said, his enthusiasm doubled, if anything. Terroir's direct translation is a sense of place, and what it means is the sum of the effects of a localized environment, inasmuch as they impact the qualities of a particular product. Yes, that can mean wine, but what if you applied these criteria to thinking about Area X? On the cusp of catching Whitby's excitement, Control said, "So you mean you would study everything about the history, natural and human, of that stretch of the coast in addition to all other elements? And that you just might, find an answer in that confluence?" Next to the idea of terroir, the theories that had been presented to Control seemed garish and blunt. Exactly. The point of terroir is that no two areas are the same, that no two wines can be exactly the same because no combination of elements can be exactly the same. I misread that sentence, but it doesn't matter. That certain varietals cannot occur in certain places, but it requires a deep understanding of a region to reach conclusions. And this isn't being done already? Whitby shrugged. Some of it, just not all of it considered together, in my opinion. I feel there is an overemphasis on the lighthouse, the tower, base camp. Those discrete elements that could be said to jut out of the landscape, while the landscape itself is largely ignored. As is the idea that Area X could have formed nowhere else, although that theory would be highly speculative and perhaps based mostly on my own observations. Control nodded, unable now to shake a sturdy skepticism. Would terroir really be more useful than another approach? If something far beyond the experience of human beings had decided to embark upon a purpose that it did not intend to allow human beings to recognize or understand, then terroir would simply be a kind of autopsy, a kind of admission of the limitations of human systems. You could map the entirety of a process, or, say, a beachhead or an invasion, only after it had happened, and still not know the who or the why. He wanted to say to Whitby, growing grapes is simpler than Area X, but refrained. I can provide you with some of my personal findings, Whitby said. I can show you the start of things. Great, Control said, nodding with exaggerated cheeriness, and was relieved that Whitby took that single word as closure to the conversation, and made a fairly rapid exit, less relieved than he seemed to take it as undiluted affirmation. Grand unified theories could backfire. For example, Central's overemphasis on trying to force connections between unconnected right-wing militia groups. Recalled that his father had made up stories about how one piece in his ragtag sculpture garden commented on that one, and how they were all part of a larger narrative. They had all occupied the same space, were by the same creator, but they had never been meant to communicate, one to another. Just as they had never been meant to molder and rust in the backyard. But that way, at least, his father could rationalize them remaining out there together, under the hot sun and in the rain, even if protected by tarps. The border had come down in the early morning, on a date that no one outside of the southern reach remembered or commemorated. Just that one inexplicable event had killed an estimated 1,500 people. How did you factor ghosts into any terroir? Did they deepen the flavor, or did they make things dry, chalky, irreconcilable? The taste in Control's mouth was bitter. If terroir meant a confluence, then the entrance through the border into Area X was the ultimate confluence. It was also the ultimate secret, in that there were no visual records of that entry point available to anyone. Unless you were there, looking across at it, you could never experience it. Nor did it help if you were peering at it through a raging thunderstorm, shoes filling up with mud, with only one umbrella between the three of you. They stood, soaked and cold, near the end of a path that wound from the barracks across the ridge above the giant sinkhole, and then on to more stable land. They were looking at the right side of a tall, sturdy, red wooden frame that tall, sturdy red wooden frame that delineated the location, the width, and height of the entrance beyond. The path ran parallel to a paint line perpetually refreshed to let you know the border lay 15 feet beyond. If you went 10 feet beyond the line, the lasers from a hidden security system would activate and turn you into cooked meat. But otherwise, the army had left as small a footprint as possible. No one knew what might change the terroir. Here, the toxicity levels almost matched those inside of Area X, which was to say, nil, nada, nothing. Even though they mentioned radiation that one time. As for terror, his personal level had been intensified by deltas of lightning that cracked open the sky and thunder that sounded like a giant in a bad mood ripping apart trees. Yet they had persevered, Cheney holding the blue and white striped umbrella aloft, arm fully extended toward the sky, and Control and Whitby huddled around him, trying to shuffle in a synchronized way along the narrow path without tripping. All of it useless against the slanted rain. "The entrance isn't visible from the side," Cheney said in a loud voice, his forehead flecked with bits of leaf and dirt. "But you'll see it soon. The path circles around to meet it head on." "Doesn't it project light?" Control smacked away something red with 6 legs that had been crawling up his pants. "Yes, but you can't see it from the side. From the side it doesn't appear to be there at all." "It is 20 feet high and 12 feet wide," Whitby added. "Or, as I say, 60 rabbits high and 36 rabbits wide." Let me restate that with better emphasis. "Or, as I say, 60 rabbits high and 36 rabbits wide," Cheney said, which elicits the old joke of Americans will measure by anything other than the metric system. It's a funny joke. If you're not American. Control, struck by a sudden generosity, laughed at that one, which he imagined brought a flush of happiness to Cheney's features, although they could barely recognize each other in the slop and mire. The area had the aspect of a shrine, even with the downpour, especially because the downpour cut off abruptly at the border, even though the landscape continued uninterrupted. Somehow, Control had expected the equivalent of the disconnect when a 2-page spread didn't quite line up in a coffee table book. But instead, it just looked like they were slogging through a huge terrarium or greenhouse, with invisible glass revealing a sunny day on the grounds beyond. They continued to the end amid a profusion of lush plant life and an alarmingly crowded landscape of bird life and insects, with deer visible in the middle distance through the veil of rain. Sue had said something during their meeting about making assumptions about terminology, and he had replied, to a roaring silence, "You mean like calling something a border?" Tracking back from stripping names from expedition members. What if when you accreted personality and other details around a mere function, a different picture emerged? After a few minutes of sloshing through mud, they curved around to come to a halt in front of the wooden structure. He had not expected any of it to be beautiful, but it was beautiful. Beyond the red wooden frame, Control could see a roughly rectangular space forming an arch at the top, through which swirled a scintillating, questing white light, a light that fizzed and flickered and seemed always on the point of being snuffed out, but never was. There was a kind of spiraling effect to it, as it continually circled back in on itself. If you blinked quickly, it almost looked as if the light consisted of 8 or 10 swiftly rotating spokes, but this was an illusion. The light was like nothing he had ever seen. It was neither harsh nor soft. It was not twee, like fairy light from bad movies. It was not the darkish light of hucksters and magicians, or anyone else looking to define light by use of shadows. It lacked the clarity of the all-revealing light of the storage cathedral, but it wasn't murky or buttery or any other descriptor he could think of right then. He imagined trying to tell his father about it, but really it was his father who could have described the quality of that light to him.
Even though it's such a tall corridor and so wide, you have to crawl with your pack as close to the middle as possible, and as far away from the sides as possible.
Cheney, confirming what Control had already read in summaries. Like cats with duct tape on their backs, slinking forward on their bellies.
No matter how you feel about enclosed or open spaces, it'll be strange in there, because you will feel simultaneously as if you are progressing across a wide open field, and as if...
Oh, wait, no, that might be what's written. Nope, it's still Cheney.
No matter how you feel about enclosed or open spaces, it'll be strange in there because you will feel simultaneously as if you are progressing across a wide open field and as if you're on a narrow precipice without guardrails and could fall off at any moment. So you exist in a confined and limitless space all at once. One reason we put the expedition members under hypnosis.
Not to mention, and Cheney never did, that the expedition leader in each case had to endure the experience without benefit of hypnosis, and that some experienced strange visions while inside. It was like being in one of those aquariums with the water overhead, but murkier, so that I could not really tell what was swimming there. Or it wasn't the water that was murky, but instead the creatures.
I saw constellations, and everything was near and far all at once.
There was a vast plain like where I grew up, and it just kept expanding and expanding until I had to look at the ground because I was getting the sense of being filled up until I would have burst. All of which could just as easily have occurred inside the subjects' minds. Nor did the length of the passageway correspond to the width of the invisible border. Some reports from returning expeditions indicated that the passageway meandered, while others described it as straight. The point was, it varied, and the time to travel through it into Area X could not be estimated except within a rough parameter of a norm of 3 hours to 10 hours. Indeed, because of this, one of the earliest fears of Central had been that the entry point might disappear entirely, even if other opinions differed. Among the files on the border, Control had found a relevant quote from James Lowry.
The door, when I shot, looked like it had always been there, and would always be there even if there was no Area X.
The director had apparently thought the border was advancing, but there was no evidence to support that view. An interceding note in the files from far up the chain of command had offered the comment that perhaps the director was just trying to get attention and money for a dying agency. Now that he saw the entrance, Control wondered how anyone would know what an advance meant.
Don't stare at it directly for too long, Whitby offered. It tends to draw you in.
I'll try not to, Control said. But it was too late. His only solace that surely if he started walking toward it, Whitby or Cheney would stop him. Or the lasers would. The swirling light defeated his attempts to conjure up the biologist. He could not get her to stand beside him, to follow the other 3 members of the 12th expedition into that light. But then, by the time she had arrived at this spot, she would already have been under a hypnotic influence. The linguist would already have left the expedition. There would have been just the 4 of them, with their packs, about to crawl through that impossible light. Only the director would have been seeing it all with clear eyes.
If Control went through her scribbled notes, if he excavated the sedimentary layers and got to the core of her, could he come back here and reconstruct her thoughts, her feelings, at that moment? How did the members of the last 11th and 12th get out of the Area X without being seen? Control asked Cheney.
There must be another exit point we haven't been able to find.
The object, observed, still not cooperating with him. A vision of his father in the kitchen when he was 14, shoving rotting strawberries into the bottom of a glass and then adding a cone of curled up paper over the top to trap the fruit flies that had gotten into the house. Why can we see the corridor? Control asked.
Not sure what you mean,
Cheney said. If it's visible, then we were meant to see it. Maybe. Who really knew? Every off-the-cuff comment Control made came, or so he thought, with a built-in echo, as if the past banal observations of visitors and new employees lingered in the air, seeking to merge same with same, and finding an exact match far too often. Cheney sucked on his cheek a second, grudgingly admitted,
That's a theory. That's definitely a theory, all right. I can't say it isn't.
Staggering thought. What might come out into the world down a corridor 20 feet tall by 12 feet wide? They stood there for long moments, bleeding time but not acknowledging it, heedless of the rain. Whitby stood apart, letting the rain soak him, contemptuous of the umbrella. Behind them, through the thunder, the hard trickle of water from the creeks gurgling back down into the sinkhole beyond the ridge. Ahead, the clarity of a cloudless summer day. Sorry if people caught that. While Control tried to stare down that sparkling, that dancing light. Enjoy your meeting as best you can, or at least stay sane and alert as best you can, optical antenna. Hopefully it's not a nose hair tugging meeting, where the only way you can stay awake is by tugging. Yoink! Zero 1-0. Fourth breach. The terroir infiltrated his thoughts again, when, late in the day, drying off, Control received the transcripts from his morning session with the biologist, the trip to the border kaleidoscoping through his head. He had just reluctantly re-tossed the mouse into the trash and repatriated the plant with the storage cathedral. Sorry. It had taken an effort of will to do that, and to close the door on the weird sermon scrawled on his wall. He hated to engage in superstition, but the doubt remained that he had made a mistake, that the director had left both mouse and plant in her desk drawer for a reason, as a kind of odd protection against... what? He still didn't know as he performed an internet search on Ghostbird's reference to the forest snail, which revealed she was quoting almost word for word from an old book by an obscure amateur parson naturalist. Something she would have encountered in college, with whatever associated memories that, too, might bring. He didn't believe it had significance, except for the obvious one. The biologist had been comparing him to an awkward snail. Then he thumbed through the transcript, which he found comforting. At one point during the session, fishing, Control had pivoted away from both tower and lighthouse, back to where she had been picked up. Question. What did you leave at the empty lot? What if, he speculated there at his desk, still ignoring the water-stained pages in the drawer next to him, the empty lot was a terroir related to the terroir that was Area X? What if some confluence of person and place meant something more than just a return home? Did he need to order a complete historical excavation of the empty lot? And what about the other two, the anthropologist and the surveyor? Mired in the arcana of the southern reach, he wouldn't have time to check on them for another few days. Oh, gosh, I'm sorry. He wouldn't have time to check on them for another few days, grudging gratitude to Grace for simplifying his job by sending them away. Meanwhile, the biologist was answering his question on the page. Answer: leave? Like what? A necklace with a crucifix? A confession? Question: no. Answer: well, why don't you tell me what you thought I might have left there? Question: your manners? That had earned him a chuckle, if a caustic one, followed by a long, tired sigh that seemed to expel all the air from her lungs. Answer: I've told you that nothing happened there. I woke up as if from an endless dream, and then they picked me up. Oh my gosh, this page. Question: do you ever dream? Now, I mean? Answer: what would be the point? Question: what do you mean? Answer: I just dream of being out of this place. Question: do you want to hear about my dreams? He didn't know why he had said this to her. He didn't know what he'd tell her. Would he tell her about the endless falling into the bay, into the maw of leviathans? To his surprise, she said, Answer: what do you dream of, John? Tell me. It was the first time she'd used his name, and he tried to hate how it had sent a kind of spark through him. John. She had brought her feet up onto the chair so she was hugging her knees and peering at him almost impishly. Sometimes you had to adjust your strategy, give up something to get something. So he did tell her his dream, even though he felt self-conscious and hoped Grace wouldn't see it in the official record, use it against him somehow. But if he'd lied, if he'd made something up, Control believed that Ghostbird would know, that even as he'd been trying to interpret her tells, she had been processing him the whole time. Even when he asked the questions, he was hemorrhaging data. He had a sudden image of information floating out the side of his head in a pixelated blood-red mist. These are my relatives. This is my ex-girlfriend. My father was a sculptor. My mother is a spy. But she had relented too, during the conversation, for a moment. Answer. Or A. I woke up in the empty lot and thought I was dead. I thought I was in purgatory, maybe, even though I don't believe in an afterlife. But it was quiet and so empty. So I waited there, afraid to leave, afraid there might be some reason I was meant to be there. Not sure I wanted to know anything else. Then the police came for me, and then the Southern Reach after that. But I still believed I wasn't really alive. What if the biologist had just that morning decided she was alive, not dead? Perhaps that accounted for the change in her mood. When he had finished reading, he could feel Ghostbird still staring at him, and she would not let his gaze drop, held him there, or he let her do it. Or he let her do it, for whatever reason. On the way back from the border, a silence had come over Control, Whitby, and Cheney, perhaps overloaded by the contrast between the sun/heat and rain/cold. But it had seemed to Control like the companionable silence of shared experience, as if he had been initiated into membership in an exclusive club without having been asked first. He was wary of that feeling. It was a space where shadows crept in that shouldn't creep in, where people agreed to things that they did not actually agree with, believing that they were of one purpose and intent. Once, in such a space, a fellow agent had called him homie, and made an offhand comment about him not being your usual kind of spick. When they were about a mile from the southern reach, Cheney said, too casually,
You know, there's a rumor about the former director and the border.
"Yes?" Here it came. There it was. How comfort led to overreach or to some half reveal of what should be hidden.
That she went over the border by herself once,
Cheney said, staring off into the distance. Even Whitby seemed to want to distance himself from that statement, leaning forward in his seat as he drove.
Just a rumor, Cheney added. No idea if it's true.
But Control didn't care about that, despite the addition being disingenuous. The truth clearly didn't worry Cheney, or he already knew it was true and wanted Control on the scent. "Does this rumor include when this might have happened?" Control asked.
Before the final 11th expedition.
Part of him had wanted to take that to the assistant director and see what she might or might not know. Another part decided that was a premature idea. So he'd chewed on the information, wondering why Cheney had fed it to him, especially in front of Whitby. Did that mean Whitby had the spine, despite the evidence, to withhold even when Grace wanted him to share? "Have you ever been over the border, Cheney?" An explosive snort.
No. Are you crazy? No.
In the parking lot at Day's End, Control sat behind the wheel, keys in the ignition, and decompressed for a moment. The rain had passed, leaving oily puddles and a kind of verdant sheen on the grass and trees. Only Whitby's purple electric car remained, at an angle across two spaces, as if it had washed up there. Time to call the voice and file his report. Getting it over with was better than letting work bleed into his evening. The phone rang and rang. The voice finally answered with a
Yes, what?
as if Control had called at a bad time. He had meant to ask about the director's clandestine border trip, but the voice's tone threw him off. Instead, he started off with the plant and the mouse. "I found something odd in the director's desk." Ellipsis. Control blinked once, twice, 3 times. As they were talking, he had noticed something. It was the smallest thing, and yet it rattled him. There was a squashed mosquito on the inside of his windshield, and Control had no idea how it had got there. He knew it hadn't been there in the morning, and he had no memory of swatting one anyway. Paranoid thought. Carelessness on the part of someone searching his car. Or did someone want him to know he was being watched? Attention divided, Control became aware of wobbles in his conversation with the voice. Almost like air pockets that pushed an airplane up and forward, while the passenger inside, him, sat there strapped in and alarmed. Or as if he were watching a TV show where the cable hiccuped and brought him 5 seconds forward every few minutes. Yet the conversation picked up where it had left off. The voice was saying, with more than usual gruffness,
I'll get you more information, and don't you worry, I'm still working on the goddamn assistant director situation. Call me tomorrow.
A ridiculous image snuck into his head of the assistant director walking into the parking lot while he was at the border, forcing the lock, rummaging through his glove box, sadistically squashing the mosquito. "I don't know if that's a good idea at this point, about Grace," Control said. "It might be better to—" But the voice had already hung up, leaving Control to wonder how it had gotten dark so quickly. Control contemplated the tangled geometry of blood and delicate limbs. He couldn't stop staring at the mosquito. He had meant to say something else to the voice, but he'd forgotten it because of the mosquito, and now it would have to wait until tomorrow. Was it possible he had squashed the mosquito reflexively and didn't remember? He found that unlikely. Well, just in case he hadn't, he'd leave the damn thing there, along with its splotch of blood. That might send some kind of message back. Eventually. Ah, the best kind of meeting. The meeting deferred. Nice to hear. Welcome back. 011. Sixth breach. Or 011? I don't know. I should maybe change that now that they're double digit. At home, Chori waited on the step. Control let him inside, put out some cat food he'd bought at the store along with a chicken sandwich, ate in the kitchen, even though Chori's meal made the space stink of greasy salmon. He watched the cat chow down, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on what he considered the failures of his day. He felt as if most of his passes had been behind his receivers, and that his high school coach was yelling at him. The wall behind the door had thrown him off. The wall and the meetings had taken up too much of his time. Even the border trip hadn't put things right, just stabilized them while opening new lines of inquiry. The idea that the director had been across the border before the final 11th expedition had returned to worry at him. Cheney, during their border trip.
I never had the idea that the director agreed with us much, you know, or she kept her own counsel, or had some other counsel, along with Grace. Or I don't know about or I don't know much about people, which is possible, I guess.
Control reached into his satchel for some of his notes from the border trip, and in doing so was shocked to find 3 cell phones there instead of 2. The sleek one used for communication with the voice, the other one for regular use, and another, bulkier. Frowning, Control pulled them out. The third was the old, non-functioning phone from the director's desk. He stared at it. How had it gotten in there? Had Grace put it in there? An old black beetle of a phone, the rippled, pitted burn across the leather cover like a bit like a carapace. Grace couldn't have done it. She must have left it in his office after all, and he must have absent-mindedly picked it up. But then why hadn't he noticed it in the parking lot after he finished talking to the voice? He set the phone on the kitchen counter, giving it a wary stare or two before he settled into the living room. What was he missing? After a few sets of half-hearted push-ups, he turned on the television. Soon he was being bombarded by a montage of reality shows, news of another school massacre, a report on another garbage zone in the ocean, and some announcers screaming out the prelims of an MMA match. He dithered between a cooking show and a mystery, 2 of his favorites, because they didn't require him to think, before deciding on the mystery, the cat purring on his lap like a revving engine.
Chori's a good lad.
As he watched the TV, he remembered a lecture in his second year of college by a professor of environmental science. The gist had been that institutions, even individual departments in governments, were the concrete embodiments of not just ideas or opinions, but also of attitudes and emotions. Like hate or empathy, statements such as, immigrants need to learn English or they're not really citizens, or all mental patients deserve our respect. That in the workings of, for example, an agency, you could, with effort, discover not just the abstract thought behind it, but the concrete emotions. The Southern Reach had been set up to investigate, and contain, Area X, and yet despite all the signs and symbols of that mission, all of the talk and files and briefs and analysis, some other emotion or attitude also existed within the agency. It frustrated him that he could not quite put his finger on it, as if he needed another sense or a sensitivity that he lacked. And yet, as Grace had said, once he became too comfortable within the Southern Reach, once he was cocooned by its embrace, he would be too indoctrinated to perceive it. That night he did not dream. He did remember being woken well before dawn by something small crawling across the roof in fits and starts, but soon enough it stopped moving. It hadn't been enough to wake the cat. O12. Sort of sorting. In the morning, back at work, he discovered that a fluorescent rod had burned out in his office, dulling the light. Control's chair and desk in particular lay under a kind of gloom. He moved a lamp from the bookcases and set it up on a shelf jutting out toward the desk on his left. The better to see that Whitby had followed through on his threat and left a thick, somewhat worn-looking document on his desk entitled Terroir and Area X, a Complete Approach. Something about the rust on the massive paperclip biting into the title page, the yellowing nature of the typed pages, the handwritten annotations in different color pens, or maybe the torn-out, taped-in images, made him reluctant to go down that particular rabbit hole. It would have to wait its turn, which might at this point mean next week or even next month. He had another session with the biologist, as well as a meeting with Grace about his agency recommendations, and then, on Friday, an appointment to view the videos from the first expedition. Among other pressing things on his mind, like a little redecorating, Control opened the door with the words hidden behind it. He took some photographs. Then, using a can of white paint and a brush requisitioned from maintenance, he meticulously painted over all of it. Every last word, every detail of the map. Grace and the others would have to get by without a memorial because he couldn't live with the pressure of those words pulsing out from behind the door. Also, the height measurements, if that's what they were. 2 coats, 3, until only a shadow remained, although the height marks, written using a different kind of pen, continued to shine through. If they were height marks, then the director had grown by a 1/4 inch between measurements, unless she'd been wearing higher heels the second time. After painting, Control set out 2 of his father's carvings from the chessboard at home, meaning for them to replace the missing talismans of plant and mouse. A tiny red rooster and a moon-blue goat. They came from a series entitled simply Mi Familia. The rooster had the name of one of his uncles, the goat an aunt. His dad had photographs from his youth of playing in the backyard with his friends and cousins, surrounded by chickens and goats, a garden stretching out of sight along a wooden fence. But Control only remembered his father's chickens, generously put, tradition or legacy chickens, named and never slaughtered. Homage chickens. Homage chickens? Homage chickens, as Control had teased his father. Because you're paying homage. Chess was a hobby he had developed that could be shared during his father's chemo treatments, and that his father could ponder and worry at when Control wasn't there in the room. Their shared affection before the cancer had been pool, at which they were both mediocre, even though they enjoyed it. But his dad's physical ailments had outstripped the mental deterioration, so that hadn't been an option. Books as a salve to the boredom of TV? No, because the bookmark just began to separate one sea of unread words from another. But with a reminder of whose turn it was, chess left some evidence of its past, even when his dad got confused toward the end. Control had press-ganged his dad's carvings into being pieces. They were a motley bunch that didn't much correlate to their function, since they were being twice reinterpreted, first as people into animals, and then into chess pieces. But he became a better player, his interest raised because abstraction had been turned into something real, and the results, although comical to them, seemed to matter more. Abuela to Bishop, as a move, had set them both to giggling. Cousin Umberto to la sobrina Mercedes. Now these carvings were going to help him. Control set the rooster on the far left corner of his desk, and the goat on the right, with the rooster facing out and the goat staring back at him. He had glued to each a nearly invisible nano camera that would transmit wirelessly to his phone and laptop. If nothing else, he meant for his office to be secure, to make of it a bastion, to take from it all unknowns, and to substitute only that which might be a comfort to him. Who knew what he might discover? He was then free to consider the director's notes. The preamble to reading the director's notes had much of the ritual of a spring cleaning. He cleared all of the chairs except his own from the office, setting them up in the hallway. Then he started to make piles in the middle of the floor. He tried to ignore the ambivalent stains revealed on the carpet. Coffee, blood, gravy, cat vomit. Clearly, the janitor and any cohorts had been banned from the director's office for quite some time. He had a vision of Grace ordering that the office be kept as is, in much the same way that on cop shows the parents of slain children allowed not a single new dust mote to enter the hallowed ground of their lost ones' bedrooms. Grace had kept it locked until his arrival, had held on to the spare key, and yet he didn't think she'd be showing up on his surveillance video. So he sat on a stool, his favorite neoclassical composer playing on his laptop, and let the music fill the room and create a kind of order out of chaos. Skipping no step, Grandpa, even though there was a skip to his step. He already had received files that morning from Grace, conveyed via a third-party administrative assistant so they could avoid talking to each other. These files detailed all of the director's official memos and reports, against which he would have to check every doodle and fragment. An inventory list, as Control thought of it. He had considered asking Whitby to sort through the notes, but with each item the security clearance fluctuated from secret to top secret to what the fuck is this secret, like some volatile stock market at dealing in futures. Grace's title for the list was too functional. Director Files, DMP of Major and Minor Memos and Reports. DMP, or Data Management Program, referred to the proprietary imaging and viewing system the Southern Reach had paid for and implemented in the 90s. Control would have gone with something pithier than Grace had, like The Director Documents, or more dramatic, like Tales from a Forgotten Agency, or The Area X Dossier. The piles had to be organized by topic so that they would at least loosely match up to Grace's DMP. Border, lighthouse, tower, island, base camp, natural history, unnatural history, general history, unknown. He also decided to make a pile for irrelevant, even though what might seem irrelevant to him might to someone else be the Rosetta Stone, if such a stone, or the pebble version, even existed among all the debris. This was a comfortable place for him, a comfortable task, familiar as penance during a period of shame and demotion, and he could lose himself in it almost as thoughtlessly as doing the dishes after dinner or making the bed in the morning. Emerge in some ways refreshed. But with the crucial difference that these piles looked in part as if he had tracked in dirt on his shoes from outside. The former director was making him into a new kind of urban farmer, building compost piles with classified material that had originated out in the world, bringing with it a rich backstory. Oak and magnolia trees had provided some of the raw material in the form of leaves, to which the director had attached napkins, receipts, even sometimes toilet paper, creating a thick mulch. The diner where Control ate breakfast had yielded several noteworthy receipts, as did a corner grocery store, where the former director had at various times shopped as a convenient last resort. The receipts indicated straggler items, not quite a formal outing for groceries. A roll of paper towels and beef jerky one time, fruit juice and breakfast cereal another time, hot dogs, a quart of skim milk, nail scissors, and a greeting card the next. The napkins, receipts, and advertising brochures from a barbecue place in her hometown of Bleekersville figured prominently and induced in Control a hunger for ribs. Bleekersville was only about 15 minutes from the Southern Reach, right off the highway that led to Headley. According to Grace, the house there had been swept clean of anything related to the Southern Reach, the results catalogued in a special Director's House section of the DMP file. Panicked thought after about an hour. What if the seemingly random surfaces on which the director had written her notes had significance? What if the words were not the whole message, just as the lighthouse keeper's deranged sermon wasn't the whole story? The storage cathedral came to mind, and although it seemed improbable, he wondered, paranoid, if some of the leaves came from Area X, then dismissed the thought as speculative and counterproductive. No, the director's vast array of textures revealed only that she had been absorbed in her task, as if she had been desperate to write down her observations in the moment, had wanted neither to forget nor to have an internal editor interrupt her search for understanding, or no hacker to peer into the inner workings of her mind, distilled down to a DMP or otherwise. He had, as a result, to okay. He had, as a result, to sort through. For some reason, this sentence structure is really breaking my brain. He had, comma space, as a result, comma space, to resort through to. We did it again. Give me a sec. While somebody's house burns down in the background. I hope nobody can hear that because it's awfully loud here. I can hear it through my headset. Okay. Let's try this one last time. He had, as a result, to sort through the. He had to sort through. Oh my god. So it interjects as a result in there in a way that just absolutely shatters my ability to coherently convey the sentence. So we're going to take this word by word. He had, comma space, as a result, comma, to sort through not just piles of primary, quote, documents, unquote, but also a haphazard record of the director's life and her wanderings through the world outside of the Southern Reach buildings. He had, as a result, to sort through not just piles of primary documents, but also a haphazard record of the director's life and her wanderings through the world outside of the Southern Reach buildings. I still mangled it. I think there's some dubious grammatical syntax in there, and I'm not sure what's throwing me most. Jeff Vandermeer sometimes does this to me. At least with CJ Sherry, when she does a long run-on sentence that uses every part of the buffalo in terms of punctuation. Thank you. Thank you, brain, for finally finding word. At least it always seems to have a logical structure, whereas this, I think, is deliberately off-putting. He does that. So we're going to read the sentence for his 17th time. I don't know what time we're on now. He had, as a result, to sort through not just piles of primary documents, but also a haphazard record of the director's life and her wanderings through the world outside of the Southern Reach buildings. This helped because he had only dribs and drabs from the official file, either due to Grace's interference or because the director herself had managed to winnow it terse. Winnow it terse. That's an interesting way to put that. She had no siblings and had grown up with her father in the Midwest. She had studied psychology at a state college, been a consultant for about 5 years. Then she had then applied for the Southern Reach through Central, where she had endured a grueling schedule designed to force her to prove herself over and over, and thus make up for her undistinguished career to date. The Southern Reach must have seemed a more attractive posting back then, and where the sparse information turned into the roiling mass of notes in her office. His request for further intel had been offered up to the labyrinthine and terse maw of Central, which had clamped shut on it. Someday a file might be spat out in his direction. So he was left with trying to build a true terroir vision of the director, her motivations and knowledge base, from everything he was sorting through, and by creating... Okay. Here's another one. This one's also broken up in a way that shatters my brain. I swear I'm not this bad at reading most of the time, but Jeff Vandermeer sometimes throws me in ways that I would think shouldn't happen. But so he was left with trying to build a true terroir vision of the director, her motivations and knowledge base, her motivations and knowledge base, from everything he was sorting through, and by creating a whole layering of other non-DMP categories in his mind. She had a subscription to a table television guide, as well as a selection of culture and art magazines, judging not just from torn pages, but from subscription renewal forms. She had owed the dentist $72.12 at one point for a cleaning not covered by her insurance, and didn't care who knew it. A bowling alley outside of town was a frequent haunt. She got birthday cards from an aunt, but either wasn't sentimental about cards or wasn't that close to the woman. She liked pork chops and shrimp with grits. She liked to dine alone, but one receipt from the barbecue place had 2 dinner orders on it. Company? Perhaps, like him, she sometimes ordered food to go, so she'd have a lunch for the next day. There was not much about the border in her notes, but that white spiral, that enormous space, did not leave him completely. There was an odd synchronicity as he worked that linked the spiral to his mother's flash of light across the sky. The literal and the metaphoric joined together across an expanse of time and context so vast that only thoughts could bridge the gap. Well, that's a pretty allegory. Sometimes Vandermeer gets you.
OUO official use only. TS top secret. SCI sensitive compartmented information. RFC really fucking classified.
Amen. I love a parade. The sedimentary layers that had I don't actually love parades, by the way. That's the only song that came into my brain at the worst time. I don't dislike parades. I've had many good experiences in parades. I just don't love parades, you know? The sedimentary layers that had existed under the plant and mouse proved the most difficult to separate out. Some pages were brittle and thin, and the scraps of paper and ragged collages of leaves had a tendency to stick together, while being infiltrated and bound more tightly by the remains of translucent roots touched by lines of crimson left behind by the plant. As Control painstakingly separated one page from another, a musty smell that had lain dormant rose up, became strong and pungent. He tried not to compare it to the stench of dirty socks. The layers continued to support that the director liked both nature and cold breakfast. And a cold breakfast. As he liberated the proof of purchase cut out of a box of bran flakes from an oak leaf stained blue by words thickened into almost unreadable ink blots, I singulared that instead of pluralizing that, sorry. That is a long run-on series of words. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28 words without a single piece of punctuation. Thanks, Jeff. Let's try that again. In one breath. I lost my place. Damn it. Where are you? I'm sorry. Ah, there we go. As he liberated the proof of purchase cut out of a box of bran flakes from an oak leaf stained blue by words thickened into an almost unreadable ink blots, What do I keep adding A? Damn it, now we have to do it again. You know why I'm doing that? It's because I'm expecting there to be a certain meter to how the words read out, and it's not there. It is just always different. And I think part of that is because that weird poem sermon thing keeps infecting my brain. And that's what I keep thinking when I think massive run-on sentence that keeps on going for a million words with no punctuation. Shall bear the fruit that enters the golden light of the earth, and there shall be no life but death rotting at the core of the... I don't even remember it now. Okay, back on track today. The layers continued to support that the director liked both nature and a cold breakfast. As he liberated the proof of purchase cut out of a box of bran flakes from an oak leaf stained blue by words thickened into almost unreadable ink blots, he knew that the cardboard had never before been unwedded from its brittle bride. Review transcripts from X10C, ESP period Anthro on LH Landing, read the cardboard. Recommend discontinuing use of black boxes for conditioning purposes, read the leaf. He placed the oak leaf on the unknown pile, as in unknown value. Other intriguing fragments revealed themselves too, some peeking out between books on the stacks or just shoved roughly between pages, less like bookmarks and more as if she had become irritated with them and was punishing the very words she had scribbled down. It was between the pages of a basic college biology textbook that looked worn enough to have been the director's own that Control found, on real paper, bizarrely printed on a dot matrix printer despite a date of only 18 months ago, a note on the 12th expedition. More bizarre sentence structure. In the note, which hadn't made it into Grace's DMP file, the director called the surveyor someone with a strong sense of reality, a good bracing foil to the others. The linguist discarded in the border prep area she called useful but not essential, possibly a dangerous addition, a sympathetic but narrow character who might deflect attention. Sympathetic to whom? I just realized that Control doesn't know what she sounds like. He might know what she sounds like. We're going to stick with her voice. Sympathetic to whom? Deflect attention from what? As you can see, I do these very, very much by the seat of my pants. And was this deflection desirable, or... Let's start the paragraph over. I'm sorry. In the note, which hadn't made it into Grace's DM... Because I lost track as I flipped the page. In the note, which hadn't made it into Grace's DMP file, the director called the surveyor someone with a strong sense of reality, a good bracing foil to the others. The linguist discarded in the border prep area she called useful but not essential, possibly a dangerous addition, a sympathetic but narrow character who might deflect attention. Sympathetic to whom? Deflect attention from what? And was this deflection desirable, or... ellipsis question mark? That is an ellipsis followed by a question mark. Or... The anthropologist was referred to by her first name, which confused Control until he suddenly recognized it. Hildy will be on board. We'll understand. He stared at that note for a while. On board with what? Understand what? Beyond a frustrating lack of context, the notes conveyed a sense that the director had been casting a play or movie. Notes for actors. Teams needed cohesion, but the director didn't seem as concerned with morale and the group dynamic as with some other quality. The note on the biologist was the most extensive and caused Control to vibrate with additional questions. Not a very good biologist, in a traditional sense, empathic more towards environments than people, forgets the reasons she went, who is paying her salary, but becomes embedded to an extraordinary extent, would know Area X better than I do from almost the first moment set foot there. Experience with similar settings, self-sufficient, unburdened, connection through her husband. What would she be in Area X? A signal? A flare? Or invisible? Exploit. Another note, found nearby in Volume 2 of a slim three-pamphlet set on xenobiology, came to mind. Bio. Expo to TA Contam? Question mark? Biologist exposure to topographical anomaly contamination was his best guess. Oh, why would I read it like that? Biologist exposure to topographical anomaly contamination was his best guess. An easy guess. That should have been in quotes. That would have made it much easier to read that out. But without a date, he could not even be sure it pertained to the same expedition. Similarly, when had keep from L and L said no hyphen no surprise been written on two separate scraps? And did L stand for Lowry, or in some esoteric and less likely way mean lighthouse keeper? That's a hard one to read aloud. It makes sense if you look at it, I swear.
Everybody get a copy of the book. You'll be able to know what's going on. Gosh darn.
He let all of this settle in, knew he had to be patient. There were a lot of notes, and a lot of pages to Grace's DMP file, nothing yet on a prior trip by the director across the border. But already he was getting the sense of undercurrents, was finding now in Whitby's terroir theory something that might apply more to the southern reach than to Area X, perhaps framed by a single mind. The idea that a dysfunctional thought could take root in a vacuum, the individual anonymous and wraith-like, unknowable because, especially at first, he or she had no interaction with other people. Because more and more in the modern internet era, you came across isolated instances of a mind virus or worm, brains that self-washed, bathed in received ideologies that came down from on high, ideologies that could remain dormant or hidden for years, silent as death until they struck. Almost anything could happen now, and did. The government could not investigate every farmer's purchase of fertilizer and fireworks, could not self-police every deviant brain within its own ranks. The thought had occurred while sorting through the scraps that if you ran an agency devoted to understanding and combating a force that constituted an insurgency, and you believed the border was, in some sense at least, advancing, then you might deviate from official protocols. That if your supervisors and colleagues did not agree with your assessment, you might come up with an alternative plan and begin to enact it on your own. That, wary and careful, you might then and only then reach out to recruit the help of others who did believe you, or at least weren't hostile, to implement that plan. Whether you let them in on the details or not. Just possibly, you might begin to work out this plan on the back of receipts from your favorite restaurants while watching TV or reading a magazine. When it came time to leave for his appointment with Grace, Control looked up to realize he had boxed himself in with piles of papers and stacked folders. Past that, the doorway full of chairs and a small collapsible table required so much effort to navigate that he wondered if he'd subconsciously been trying to keep something out. 013. Recommendations. Control had wanted to impose himself on Grace's territory, to show her he was comfortable there, but that meant when he arrived she was in the middle of a ridiculously cheerful conversation with her administrative assistant. While he waited, Control reviewed the basics being all that had been given to him, for whatever reason. Grace Stevenson, Homo sapiens, female, family originally from the West Indies. She was third generation in this country and the eldest of 3 daughters. The parents had worked hard to put all 3 through college, and Grace had graduated valedictorian of her class with dual degrees in political science and history, followed by training at Central. Then, during a special op, she'd injured her leg, no details on how, and washed up on the shores of the Southern Reach. No, that wasn't right. The director had picked her name out of a hat? Cheney had made some noises to that effect at one point on their border trip. But she had to have harbored larger ambitions at some point, so what had kept her here? Just the director? For from the start of her stint at the Southern Reach, Grace Stevenson had entered a kind of holding pattern, if not a slow slide into stagnation. The personal depths of that pit, probably her messy, drawn-out divorce almost 8 years ago, that event timed almost to the month of the college graduation of her twin boys. A year later, she had informed Central about her relationship with a Panamanian national, a woman, so that she could again be fully vetted and deemed no security risk, which she wasn't. A planned mess, then, but still traumatic. Her boys were doctors now, and also immortalized in a desk photo of them at a soccer game. Another photo showed her arm in arm with the director. The director was a big woman, with the kind of frame where you couldn't tell if she ran to fat or was muscular. They were at some Southern Reach company picnic, a barbecue station jutting into the frame from the left, and people in flowery beach shirts in the background. The idea of agency social events struck Control as absurd for some reason. Both photos were already familiar to him. After the divorce, the assistant director's fate had been ever more joined to that of the director, whom she'd had to cover for several times, if he was reading between the lines correctly. The story ended with the director's disappearance, and Grace landing the booby prize, getting to be the assistant director for life. Oh, yes, and as a result of all this, and more, Grace Stevenson fostered an overwhelming sense of hostility toward him. An emotion he sympathized with, although only to a point, which was probably his failing. Empathy is a losing game, his father had liked to say, sometimes worn down by the casual racism he encountered. If you had to think about it, then you were doing it wrong. The assistant finally gone, Control sat down opposite Grace while she held the printout of his initial list of recommendations at arm's length, not so much because it smelled or was otherwise offensive, but because she refused to get progressive lenses. Would she take the recommendations as a challenge? They were deliberately premature, but he hoped so. Although it certainly didn't bode well that a mini tape recorder lay whirring in front of him, her response to his presence in her space. But he had practiced his mannerisms in the mirror that morning, just to see how nonverbal he could be. In truth, most of his admin and managerial recommendations could apply to any organization that had been rudderless, or, to be generous, operating with half a rudder, for a few years. The rest were stabs in the dark, but whatever they cut was as likely to flens lard as hamstring anyone. What? Oh, cut the fat. Okay. I get it. That is an awfully oblique, like multi-layered, idiomatic reference that nobody outside of someone who knows trimming the fat is going to understand. Let's try that again. The rest were stabs in the dark, but whatever they cut was as likely to flens lard as hamstring anyone. He wanted the flow of information to go in multiple directions, so that, for example, Sue the linguist had access to classified information from other agency departments. He also wanted to approve long forbidden overtime and nighttime working hours, since the electricity in the building had to stay on 24 hours a day anyway. He had noticed most of the staff left early. Some other things were unnecessary, but with any luck, Grace would waste time and energy fighting him on them. "That was fast," she said finally, tossing the paper-clipped pages of his list back across the desk at him. The pages slid into his lap before he could catch them. "I did my homework," Control said, whatever that meant. "A conscientious schoolboy, a star pupil." "The first part," Control half agreed, not sure he liked the way she said it. Grace didn't bother wasting even an insincere smile in response. "Let me get to the point. Someone has been interfering with my access to Central this week, making inquiries, poking around. But whoever is doing you this favor has no tact, or whatever faction is behind it doesn't have quite enough pull." "I don't know what you're talking about," Control said, his nonverbal mannerisms sagging in surprise along with the rest of him, despite his best efforts. Faction. Despite his daydream that about the voice having a Black Ops identity, it had not occurred to him that his mother might be heading up a faction, which led him automatically to the idea of true Shadow Ops, along with an opposition. It threw him a little that Central might be that fragmented. Just how Jesus Christ, how, how Rhinoceros Crucian. Just how elephantine, how Rhinoceros Crucian had the voice's efforts been in following up on Control's request? And what did Grace use her contacts for when she wasn't turning them against him? Grace's look of disgust told him what she thought about his answer. "Then in that case, John Rodriguez, I have no comment on your recommendations, except to say that I will begin to implement them in as excruciatingly slow a fashion as possible. You should begin to see a few of them, like buy new floor cleaner, in place by next quarter. Possibly. Maybe." He had a vision, again, of Grace spiriting away the biologist, of multiple mutual attempted destructions, until somewhere up in the clouds, atop two vast and blood-drenched escalators, they continued to do battle, years from now. Control's stiff nod, gruffly acknowledging defeat, wasn't the mannerism he'd been hoping to use. But she wasn't done. Her eyes glittered as she opened a drawer and pulled out a mother-of-pearl jewelry box. "Do you know what this is?" she asked him. "A jewelry box?" he replied, confused, definitely back on his heels now. "This is a box full of accusations," Grace said, holding it toward him like an offering. "With this jewelry box I thee despise." What is a box of accusations? Although he didn't want to know. With a clink and tinkle, the yawning velvet mouth sent a handful of bugs Control recognized all too well, rolling and skittering across her blotter at him. Most of them came to a stop before the edge, but a couple followed the list onto his lap. The rotting honey smell had intensified again. "That is a box of accusations." Attempting a comeback, aware it was feeble. "I see only one accusation there, made multiple times. I haven't emptied it yet." "Would you like to empty it now?" She shook her head. "Not yet, but I will if you continue to interfere with Central, and you can take your spies with you." Should he lie? That would defeat the purpose of sending the message. "Why would I bug you?" With a look that he knew undercut his innocence, even as indignation rose in him as ardently as if he were innocent. Because in a way, he thought he was innocent. Action bred reaction. Lose a few expedition members, gain a few bugs. She might even recognize some of them. But Grace persisted. You did. You also rifled through my files, looked in all my drawers. No, I didn't. This time his anger was backed by something real. He hadn't ransacked her office, only placed the bugs there, but now even that act troubled him the more he thought about it. It was out of character, had served no real purpose, had been counterproductive. Grace continued on patiently. If you do it again, I'll file a complaint. I've already changed the passkey combination on my door. Anything you need to know, you can just ask me. Easily said, but Control didn't think it was true, so he tested it. Did you put the director's cell phone in my satchel? Couldn't bring himself to ask the even more ludicrous question, did you squash a mosquito in my car, or anything about the director and the border. Now, why would I do that? She asked, echoing him, but she looked serious, puzzled. What are you talking about? Keep the bugs as souvenirs, he said. Put them in the Southern Reach old antique shop and sell them to tourists. No, I mean it. What are you talking about? Rather than respond, Control got up, retreated into the corridor, not sure if he heard laughter from behind him or some distorted echo through the overhead vent. O14. Later, as he was. Oh, sorry, there's an actual chapter title? Hello. 014. Heroic Heroes of the Revolution. Later, as he was wallowing in the notes, plugging his ears and eyes with them, to forget about Grace, if he hadn't ransacked Grace's office, who had? The expedition wing buzzed him, and an excitable-sounding male voice told Control that the biologist was not feeling good at all. She says she's not up for an interview today. When he asked what was wrong, the man told him, she's been complaining of cramps and a fever. The doctor says it's a cold. A cold? A cold was nothing. Hit the ground running. The notes in these sessions were still firmly within his domain. He didn't want to postpone, so he'd go to her. With any luck, he wouldn't bump into Grace. Whitby he could have used help from, but even though he'd buzzed him, the man was making himself scarce. As he said that he'd stop by soon, Control realized that it might be some ploy. The obvious one of not playing along, but also that by going he might be giving up some advantage or confirming that she held some power over him. But his head was full of scraps of notes, and the puzzle of a possible clandestine trip by the director across the border, and the deadly echo of muffled interiors of jewelry boxes. He wanted to clear it out, or fill it up with something else for a while. He left his office, headed down the corridor. Of the smattering of personnel in the hall beyond, some were actually in lab coats for once. For his benefit? Bored? A pale, gaunt man who looked vaguely familiar murmured to the black woman walking beside him as they passed. Eager to get on with it, came the reply. You prefer this place. You really do, don't you? Should he be playing it by the book more? Perhaps. He couldn't deny that the biologist had gotten lodged inside of his head. A faint pressure that made the path leaking. Wow, I'm having a hard time today. A faint pressure that made the path leading to the expedition wing narrower, the ceilings lower, the continuous seeking tongue of rough green carpet curling up around him. They were beginning to exist in some transitional space between interrogation and conversation, something for which he could not quite find a name. Every time the biologist spoke, something changed in his world, which he found suspicious on some level, resented it for the distraction. But not a flirtation, no, nor even the ordinary emotional bond. He knew with absolute certainty that he would not become overly fixated or obsessional, enter into some downward spiral, if they continued to talk, to share the same space. That had no place in his plans, didn't fit his profile. The expedition wing featured 4 layers of obvious security, with a debriefing room they usually used perched on the edge of the outer layer. Right after you passed through a decontamination zone that scanned you for everything from bacteria to the ghost of that rusty nail that had risen up through your foot on the rocky beach when you were 10. Considering the biologist had stood in a festering empty lot full of weeds, rusted metal, cracked concrete, and dog shit for hours before arriving, this seemed pointless. But still they did it, and with an unsmiling and calm efficiency. Beyond that, all was rendered in an almost blinding white that contrasted with the washed out teal and copper textures of the rooms off the corridor. 3 more locked doors lay between the rest of the southern reach and the suites, aka the holding areas. A texture and tone that might once have been futurist but now felt retro-futurist clung to black and white furniture that had been an abstract modernist quality. That had an abstract modernist quality. Sorry. In the minimalist foyer and the rec rooms that served as preamble to the suites, you could also find a novel's worth of photographs and portraits that had no relationship to reality. The photographs had been carefully chosen to suggest post-mission success, complete with grins and cheers, when they actually depicted pre-mission prep, often for expeditions gone disastrously wrong, or actors from photo shoots. The portraits, a long procession of them ending at the suites, were worse, in Control's estimation. They depicted all 25 returning members of the first expedition, the triumphant pioneers who had encountered the pristine wilderness that had in fact killed all but Lowry. This was the alternative reality any staff that came into contact with expedition members had to support. This was the fiction that came with its own made up or tailored stories of bravery and endurance, meant to evoke these same qualities in the current expedition. Like some socialist dictatorship's glorious heroes of the revolution. What did it mean? Nothing. Had the biologist believed it all? Perhaps. The tale wanted to be believed, begged to be believed. A story of good old national can-do pride. Roll up your sleeves and get down to work, and if you try hard enough, you'll come back alive and not a broken-down zombie with a distant gaze and cancer in place of a personality, and an intact short-term memory. Hoorah, America! Or glorious Soviet Russia, as the case may be. He found Ghostbird in her... Excuse me. Let's choke on ourselves. He found Ghostbird in her room, on her cot, or, someone other than him might have reported back, her bed. The place combined the ambiance of a whitewashed barracks, a summer camp, and a failing hotel. The same pale walls, although here you could see painted over graffiti, the same as in a prison cell. The high ceiling included a skylight, and on the side wall a narrow window, too high for the biologist to peer out of it. The bed had been built into the far wall, and opposite it a TV with a DVD player. Approved movies only, and a couple of approved channels. Nothing too realistic. Nothing that might fill in the amnesia. It was mostly ancient science fiction and fantasy movies or melodramas. Documentaries and news programs were on the no list. Animal shows could go either way. "I thought I would visit you this time, since you don't feel well," he said, through his surgical mask. Sorry. "I thought I would visit you this time, since you don't feel well," he said, through his surgical mask. The attendant had already said she had given her permission. You thought you'd crash my sickness party and take advantage of me not being at full strength, she said. Her eyes were bloodshot and hooded with shadow, her face drawn. She was still wearing the same odd janitorial military outfit, this time with red socks. Even sick, she looked strong. She must do push-ups and pull-ups at a ferocious rate, was all he could think. No, he said, spinning an ovoid plastic chair so, before he'd thought through the visual. Oh, geez. He said, spinning an ovoid plastic chair so, before he'd thought through the visual, he could lean against the back, legs awkwardly splayed to either side. Did they not allow real chairs for the same reason airports only had plastic knives? No, I was concerned. I didn't want to drag you to the debriefing room. He wondered if the medication for her sickness had made her fuzzy, if he should come back later. Or not at all. He had become uncomfortably aware of the power imbalance between them in this setting. Of course, forest snails are known for their courtesy. If you'd read further in your biology text, you would have discovered this is true. That earned him half a laugh, but also her turning away from him on the bed cot as she hugged an extra yellow pillow. Oh no, an extra yellow pillow, not extra hyphen yellow. It's not a more yellow pillow than usual. It's just an extra pillow that happens to be yellow. Her V of a back faced him, the fabric of her shirt pulled tight, the delicate hairs on the smooth skin of her neck revealed to him with an almost microscopic precision. We could go into the common area if you would prefer. No, you should see me in my unnatural environment. It seems nice enough, he said, then wished he hadn't. The ghost bird has a usual daily range of 10 to 20 square miles, not a cramped space for pacing of, say, 40 feet. He winced, nodded in recognition, changed the subject. I thought maybe we'd talk about your husband, and also the director. We won't talk about my husband, and you're the director. Sorry, I meant the psychologist. I misspoke. Cursing and forgiving himself at the same time. She swiveled enough to give him a raised eyebrow, right eye hidden by the pillow, then fell back into contemplating the wall. Misspoke? I meant the psychologist. No, I think you meant director. Psychologist, he said stubbornly, perhaps with too much irritation. There was something about the casualness of the conversation that alarmed him. He should not have come anywhere near her private quarters. If you say so. Then, as if playing on his discomfort, she turned again so she was on her side facing him, still clutching the pillow. She peered up at him and said with a kind of sleepy cheekiness, What if we share information? What do you mean? He knew exactly what she meant. You answer a question and I'll answer a question. He said nothing, weighing the threat of that versus the reward. He could lie to her. He could lie to her all day long, and she'd never know. Okay, he said. Good. I'll start. Are you married or ever been married? No and no. 0 for 2. Are you gay? That's another question. And no. Fair enough. Now ask away. What happened at the lighthouse? Too general. Be more specific. When you went inside the lighthouse, did you climb to the top? What did you find? She sat up, back to the wall. That's 2 questions. Why are you looking at me that way? I'm not looking at you in any particular way. He'd just become aware of her breasts, which hadn't happened during prior sessions, and now was trying to become unaware of them again. But that's 2 questions. Apparently, he'd given the correct response. Yes, you're right about that. Which one do you want answered? What did you find?
Who says I remember any of it? You just did.
So tell me.
Journals. Lots of journals. Dried blood on the steps. A photograph of the lighthouse keeper.
A photograph?
Yes.
Can you describe it?
Two middle-aged men in front of the lighthouse, a girl out to the side, the lighthouse keeper in the middle. Do you know his name?
Saul Evans.
He said without thinking, but couldn't see the harm, was already mulling over the significance of a photograph that hung in the director's office, also existing in the lighthouse.
That's your question.
He could tell she was disappointed. She frowned, shoulders slumped. Could tell as readily that the name Saul Evans meant nothing to her.
What else can you tell me about the photo?
It was framed, hanging on the wall at the middle landing, and the lighthouse keeper's face was circled.
Circled?
Who had circled it, and why? That's another question.
Yes.
Now tell me what your hobbies are.
What? Why?
It seemed like a question for the wider world, not the Southern Reach. What do you do when you're not here? Control considered that.
I feed my cat.
She laughed, chortled actually, ending in a short coughing fit. That's not a hobby,
More like a vocation.
he admitted.
No, but I jog. I like classical music. I play chess sometimes. I watch TV sometimes. I read books, novels.
Nothing very distinctive there, she said.
I never claimed to be unique. What else do you remember from the expedition?
She squinted, eyebrows applying pressure to the rest of her face as if that might help her memory. That's a very broad question, Mr. Director. Very broad.
You can answer it however you like.
Oh, thank you.
I just mean that.
I know what you mean, she said. I almost always know what you mean.
Then answer the question.
It's a voluntary game, she explained. We can stop at any time. Maybe I want to stop now. That recklessness again, or something else? She sighed, crossed her arms. Something happened at the top. I saw something bad, but I'm not quite sure what. A green flame, a shoe. It's confused, like it's in a kaleidoscope. It comes and goes. It feels as if I'm receiving someone else's memories from the bottom of a well, in a dream.
Someone else's memories?
It's my turn. What does your mother do?
That's classified.
I bet it is, she said, giving him an appraising look. He ended the session soon thereafter. What was true empathy anyway, but sometimes turning away, leaving someone alone? Tired and in her room, she had become not so much less sharp as almost too relaxed. She was confusing him. He kept seeing sides of her that he had not known existed, that had not existed in the biologist he had known from the files and transcripts. He felt as if he'd been talking to someone younger today, someone more glib and also more vulnerable, as if he'd chosen to exploit that. Perhaps it was because he had invaded her territory while she was sick, or perhaps she was, for some reason, trying out personalities. Some part of him missed the more confrontational ghost bird. As he went back through the layers of security, passing the faked portraits and photos, he acknowledged that at least she had admitted some of her memories of the expedition were intact. That was a kind of progress. Although it still felt too slow, felt every now and then as if everything was happening too slow, and that he was taking too long to understand. One day her portrait would be up on the wall. When the subject was still alive, did they have to sit for those, or were they created from existing photographs? Would she have to recount some fiction about her experiences in Area X without ever having a complete memory of what had actually happened? And with that, I'm going to have to break it off there.
I got a scooch. It's too bad because I actually kind of wanted to read the next chapter lit section, but my time's limited because it ends on a nice little sting. But we'll just do that section right at the beginning next week. And next week, I think, is going to wind up being our. We're now going to be weird, off putting horror. Like psychological creepiness. Installments. I'd have to double check to find out, but we will see. No, it is not. It's going to be the beginning. It's going to be the bit that presages that, which is almost as good. Alrighty, I gotta run. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in live. To everyone who didn't tune in and is listening to this post facto on the tube of you by our great corporate overlord, Google. Hi. I do these live. That's why they're really, really, really rough. They're extremely rough because I do them live in front of a live studio audience of literally whoever's tuning in. It's just screaming into the void, really, but it's fun screaming into the void when it's good, fun literature. And yeah, I do it every Friday starting at about noon Eastern Standard Time. Sometimes I'm a smidgen late. But them's the breaks. But yeah, with that, hopefully people dig it. At the end of every month, I usually update the playlists I have. It has occurred to me that maybe the playlists aren't easy to get to, but I don't know if that's entirely my fault. If there's some way of making playlists more obvious on my video channel, I'd be happy to hear it if they're not obvious. If they are obvious and it's no problem, great. If it is a problem, then please tell me what I can do to improve it. I try to get everything into its appropriate playlist, particularly with the books. Everything else just kind of goes into a general lengthy playlist. And I do that for the books too, but I try to have for at least the books an individual playlist per book. And I may consider making a. No, I don't think I will actually. I was considering making a broader playlist that is the entire novel trilogy, but I'll just leave it accordingly. If there, I may do that if that winds up making it easier to be organized out for people to conveniently take in the whole thing when they want to. But it's a lot of reading, so it's like, I mean, that's literally hundreds of hours per one. Or two, let's see, if each installment is like 8 installments, 2 hours per, 8 times 2, 16 times 3. It's not actually 100. It's, well, between the different novels, it's a lot. It's a lot. Okay. It's rather a lot. So this is the post-reading ramble where I ramble for like half an hour, which I shouldn't do, but I'm going to have to cut it short. Actually, the ramble I want to do, I'll save for a later one. So we're not going to do that today. I am just going to call it here. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in. If you're not tuning in and watching this after the fact, hi, thanks. Stay safe, all of you. Stay sane, stay toasty or cool as per your preference, as your geographical limits permit. And be decent to each other as best you can. All right, with that, I'm going to run. Thanks again. See you all later.